that are important and relevant for many of the participants and that address some of the features of the work on health for indigenous women. We're going to talk about traditional birth attendance. We're going to talk about culturally appropriate services for indigenous communities. We're going to talk about health workforce and governance in the dimension of governance on what's happening on the public service that is provided to indigenous communities and marginalized populations, but also governance in terms of how the resources are allocated and the budgets are designed and implemented towards indigenous and vulnerable populations. And for this, we have a selected panel of speakers that have been addressing all these issues in different contexts, and I'm very happy to be with them. We are with Claudia Lema from Salud Sin Límites Peru, Health Unlimited Peru, Vandana Prasad from PHRN India, Luz Estrada, Foro Salud, Puno, Peru, Yasminka Frischik from ESE Macedonia, Jocelyn Talley, Torres and Cape, HHS Australia, and Stephanie Top, ICU, also from Australia. I'm very happy to be with you. Each presenter is going to have 5 minutes. We have like 40 minutes, and then we want to leave enough time for the participants to intervene and say how the topics that have been presented are relevant for the countries where you work, for the people you work with, and see if we could have some like overall conclusions on what is needed in this moment to be strengthened or to be addressed whenever we are covering those issues. So we go first with Claudia from Health Unlimited.
There was a realization that healthcare goals were not being met by offering regular services to these women. The birth, the number of births that happened in health facilities was very low. Women were happy to come for antenatal care, but then they would choose to give birth at home. And that was understood as a risk. So healthcare decision makers and providers decided to go for culturally appropriate services with the aim to attract users. And this has evolved over the years to a stronger rights perspective. And now, I think, at least at the level of discourse, most healthcare providers and decision makers are able to say that we do this not only to attract users, but also because indigenous people have the right to be treated as they wish, as they prefer, according to the cultural understanding of birth and their own indigenous medical system. How these culturally appropriate services include or not traditional traditional indigenous providers, other health providers that are not nurses or doctors, but are maybe the knowledgeable people from the community, traditional birth attendants. In some places, there is a coordination with them, which means that that these services would use them to contact pregnant women, to identify who is pregnant at an early stage and bring the pregnant women to the services, but then they are dismissed. So it's a coordination. We train you to identify risk factors or a risky pregnancy, but then when you bring the woman, be gone. You don't have a role. And in other cases, there is they aim to include traditional birth practitioners and other kind of health providers from the community during the whole process, not only to identify and bring the woman to the service, but also to participate in the service, which makes for all the participants much more sense. Because if you are a traditional birth attendant, your identity, your professional identity, so to speak, is about participating in birth, and not about bringing somebody to the service.
The accountability framework does not adequately replace in any manner the rights framework, and I think that that has to be primary, because the nature in which accountability work has happened in definitely in India, and I think in other parts of the world as well, listening to other colleagues, is accountability of the government to be providing the services that it has said is going to provide. Now, our point is basically that the services they say they're going to provide are by no means adequate to marginalized communities, and that itself has to be turned on its head. So the starting point cannot be services, the starting point has to be rights, and they should be economic, social, cultural rights in their entirety, and that changes the discourse quite certainly. The second point that one would like to make is that if rights are concerned, if our societal goals are the concern rather than services and schemes and programs, then mobilization and collectivization is non-negotiable, and without that, that's not going to happen. So every process, I'm really addressing myself to practitioners and advocates and people who are trying to represent this issue the best way they can. So mobilization and collectivization is absolutely critical. Therefore, magic bullets and technical solutions, they may be just a part of what we do, but that cannot be the main part of what we do by any means. That also means that larger social determinants, the more distal they are key in our understanding to health and nutrition, and so therefore the work must in some manner encompass that with whatever limitations that piece of work has, and the structural determinants of the fact why tribal communities are so very marginalized. The third point is, and very necessary for governance and any of this to happen, is representation at all levels. I mean, look at even the Indian contingent to this conference, for instance, and you will note that there are very few people coming from tribal communities who are representing themselves, and we are trying, we are conscious, but it's not good enough, and I think it must at some point become a non-negotiable, and that applies to the system as well. So at all levels of governance, local self-governance, and this can only happen through adequate decentralization and devolution also. Financial devolution, decentralization of governance right to the bottom. We have an excellent structure in India which really has not been allowed to really fairly operate, and that requires support and capacity building. It requires a vision to make that happen. It's not going to just happen on its own. So representation at all levels, including our own. And then now coming more to health specific issues, I think many of us have been talking about and noting in various ways the hegemony of the biomedical sciences where health and nutrition are concerned, and this especially applies to people who are living in tribal areas and tribal communities, and that needs to be broken down in some way. Now, the only way that can really happen, this respect for tribal communities as knowledge bearers, primarily knowledge bearers, not just also knowledge bearers, but primarily knowledge bearers about their own situation, their own context, can only happen through participatory work. So for me, I think that should become a non-negotiable. If you're working with tribal communities, the work has to be as participatory as possible, and you should be forced to spell out how your work is participatory. Every program, every scheme, and that should be part of our accountability framework as a tick box that that we participate.
Going to speak about traditional birth attendants, and taking as a base traditional birth attendants, I want to speak about the culture of our indigenous communities in Peru. Traditional birth attendants are called by the Peruvian official health system empiric birth attendants. Luz disagrees with this definition because it's not that they are empiric or just practical birth attendants, but there's science as well in the way they work. However, Peruvian health system has forbidden the possibility of traditional birth attendants to be integrated to the system. So they allocate to them just the function of being like health promoters or advisors, informants on whenever there's a pregnant woman in the community. So at the end, she needs to go to the health facility to give birth. So there's no space in Peruvian health system by norm for traditional birth attendants to help the delivery at the house. Previous to this norm that excluded traditional birth attendants on the possibility of helping the delivery of babies, between 1995 and 2000 year, traditional birth attendants were registered and they even were trained, because as they didn't know how to help the delivery, they were somehow trained on the use of some little bag for baby delivery with some materials that were part of the Occidental way of delivery, so they could learn to have non-infected delivery and also to help babies breathe at the beginning. However, they received the training, they accepted the bag, but they never used it. So after this first, it was not new, the idea of training traditional birth attendants for a safer delivery. However, after those years, there were different norms that were disencouraging traditional birth attendants, which were not only women, they were also in the ending world. There are many men who are traditional birth attendants. They were progressively disencouraged to be part of the process, as the home deliveries were forbidden. And I have to say, if you were a contracted provider in a public health facility and there was any home delivered in 2000 year, 2002 year, you were just taken out of the system. So your contract was closed. So if you had a birth delivery in the home, your contract was closed. So you could imagine the pressure that the providers placed on the families to have birth deliveries at the facilities, even with some disrespect of their rights. Also, there's a complete integral approach on issues like the difference between hot and cold, which is very important in the ending world. The presence of the family, particularly the presence of the husband, who plays a role of support in the moment of the delivery. In Peru, there's no single facility except the private facilities where the husband could be present at the delivery. And something very important is that in the delivery, the baby is born and is taken care, but also the placenta plays a role. They used to say that there are like two babies, one for the life, one for the mother earth. And the placenta is buried in the earth with all the good wishes of the family for the future of the newborn. So it's like a little ceremony that they have after the delivery. And you could imagine how a woman feels, and any woman feels when they see that the placenta is never given to them, even though they ask for it, and it's just thrown out, in the garbage. So it's just, they don't believe, providers don't believe, and they don't care about the babies.
Most of the times when we ask whether we need certain financial assistance or support on behalf of the state to implement those activities that we asked, or the practices that we asked to be introduced into our communities, we were said like, you should not put the financial side into the proposal because the parliament will not accept or adopt, or the government will not adopt those policies and introduce those practices. So that was usually the thing that we said, that we thought that it's really logical to do if we wanted to achieve something. But of course, when we started to monitor whether those activities that we proposed or practices that we are speaking now should be introduced into our communities, the people should enjoy it, it was very evident that the money was not allocated. And if the money are not allocated, then of course what we ask is not going to be implemented, and the people who we are working on behalf or advocating on their behalf could not enjoy those rights. So practically what we did is started to look at the budgets of either health policies. I don't know what type of health policies do you have, but in our country we have a health policies in a form of laws. Of course the law is one policy, but also the central budget, the budget of the state is a policy, so you should also look at that point. I have to say that that during the experience that we have, actually what we taught as a lesson from budget monitoring and analysis, it's not something which is scientific. Everybody can do it. Not only economists, because most of the people think that for the budget monitoring and analysis you need someone who is a professional. No, that's not the true, because we have learned it as, I don't know, lawyers, medical doctors, or whatever. You can also teach your communities how to do budget monitoring, because it's their money. They're contributing to the budget of the country, and they have a right to know how the money are allocated and how the money are spent actually.
So we do a lot of community development with our communities. We're very remote, so our women have to fly to Cairns 10 weeks prior to having their babies. So a lot of them, Saibai, which is probably a kilometre away from the Papua New Guinea border, they have to fly down, leave all their family, go down there 10 weeks, and if they're a high risk, I say high risk because of chronic disease, they also then spend probably an extra 2 to 4 weeks away from their families. A lot of them run home and have their babies back there, and then they get evac'd out, emergency evac'd out. But because we don't have facilities within our primary healthcare centres, they have to fly out. A lot of our primary healthcare centres only have health workers that are in that centre. They don't have doctors, they don't have nurses, and if a doctor turns up, he turns up for 2 hours to see probably 300 people. So it's not worth them coming. We work in a governance structure as a health worker, so we do medications, but we have a primary clinical care manual that we work under so that we're covered by government rights.
What I wanted to talk about briefly in my 10 minutes was a project that we've been conducting together. It's a research project, and it's about trying to understand what some of the governance challenges might be to further supporting and empowering the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workers in the Torres Strait. Over the last 6 months, we've conducted almost 60 interviews with health workers, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workers, as well as a number of their colleagues and community members to try and understand these issues. Thinking first about what the role means to the individual. It's not unlike community health workers in many settings. It's a complex role. It's not as easily defined as nursing or a medical doctor profession. It involves this combination, as Joss said, of cultural workage, health promotion and health education, and being a clinical extender, a clinical service provider. And one of the features of the health worker position in Australia is that from clinic to clinic, depending on the profile of the community, the profile of the clinic itself, and how comparatively remote it is, the emphasis of the role can change. In some places, health workers focus very much on their cultural brokerage role. They're very much about helping people navigate a system or a clinic which has sufficient professional health providers. In the far outer islands of the Torres Strait, which is closer to Port Moresby than it is to the state capital of Brisbane, like 1,500 kilometres away, let alone Canberra, which is almost 6,000 kilometres away, the emphasis is on clinical service delivery. They are frontline trauma providers. So the emphasis of the role can change. And the expectations of the service and of the community can change depending on that.